Well, good afternoon, everyone. And I think we might as well get our program started. And I thank you all for coming today. This is the first time we've ever had something on Father's Day. And in fact, a number of the state historic sites are doing the same thing this weekend. So we're grateful for your presence and grateful to Rushad Thomas, who is with the Coolidge Foundation, for taking his time out today. He's just fresh back from Dallas, Texas for about a week or so, right? And so that he's all right at and bushy tail ready to go to tell us all about Calvin Coolidge and his special relationship to his father. If you've read Calvin Coolidge's autobiography, you realize that there are many mentions of his dad, and our permanent exhibit down the hall, which I hope you have a chance to see, has many references to Calvin, his father, and letters written home. It shows what great influence the two had on each other. And so, I think without further ado, I'll turn this over to Rushad and enjoy. Thank you again for coming today. My name is Bill Jenny, and I'm the site administrator.
Thank you, Bill. Alrighty, like Bill said, welcome to the President Calvin Coolidge State Historic Site and to the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation. I'm Rushad Thomas. I'm the Program and Editorial Associate at the Foundation, and it will be my pleasure to help you explore a little bit deeper into the relationship between President Calvin Coolidge and his father. Those of you who know me know I have a deep reverence for President Calvin Coolidge. Politics aside, there are few more noble, singular men who've held the highest office in our land than the man from Plymouth Notch. It is a deep and humbling pleasure to work for the foundation that bears his name, doing work that advances his cause. I hope that my words here today will enlighten you and help you to understand more deeply this American original, Calvin Coolidge, who, with the tender love and guidance of Colonel John Coolidge, his father, rose from this hamlet in the Green Mountains to the White House in Washington, D.C. There are many examples of presidential dads playing an important role in the lives of their sons. Two of the most prominent examples would certainly be Joseph P. Kennedy, right? Father President John F. Kennedy, and President George H.W. Bush, the father of President George W. Bush. Each presidential father-son relationship has its own unique characteristics, and some of these relationships have been frosty at best, or non-existent at worst. Think of our current president, Barack Obama, who I believe only met his father twice in his life, or once or twice, I think twice in total, before he was killed in a car accident during the president's teenage years, or his young adult years. Or also like President Reagan, whose father, Jack, was a hopeless alcoholic, whom Reagan once during his teenage years had to drag into the house off the front stoop on one frigid Illinois winter night after one of his more extreme drinking binges. So it's not all rosy when it comes to presidential father-son relationships, sadly. The relationships of presidential fathers and sons run the gamut. However, here in Plymouth Notch, we have the distinct honor of recalling today one of the most important and fortunately healthy presidential father-son relationships in American history, that of Colonel John C. Coolidge with his only son, Calvin. In our conversation today, we are going to touch on a number of major themes that define the relationship between Colonel John and Calvin, and hopefully provide a personal snapshot of these two very important men. Now, one of the best sources of information about the relationship between Colonel John and President Coolidge is this wonderful book, Your Son, Calvin Coolidge, which is available in both stores here at the historic site. I encourage you all to purchase it. It's published by the Vermont Historical Society. And it compiles all the letters that are in existence, well, actually all the letters that the Vermont Historical Society has from Calvin to his father. This book was published in 1968, and it's really one of the most wonderful, quiet ways, I think, that John Coolidge, the son of the president that some of you knew when he was alive, worked assiduously over the many decades to preserve and publicize the legacy of his father and his grandfather. John Coolidge wrote the introduction to Your Son, Calvin Coolidge, and that introduction, I think, is one of the most comprehensive explications of the relationship between the Colonel and Calvin. John writes that his father and grandfather did not physically resemble one another. Colonel John was 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, big-boned, and sturdy. Calvin, however, had a much smaller frame and a much more fragile constitution, with, quote, features more delicately molded and a fair complexion, unquote. Yet he also notes that his dad and grandpa had a strong bond of affection. Indeed, they are one of the few presidential father-son pairs to ever be photographed kissing one another, or filmed kissing one another, in public. And you can see that from old 1920s newsreels here in Plymouth Notch. The colonel, looking back on his son's childhood, said that he had been a trustworthy boy who, quote, did what he was told to do and kept a careful accounting of his expenditures, unquote. Any accountants among us would be proud. It was Calvin's birth that made John a father. Calvin was his eldest child. When his wife Victoria Josephine Moore gave birth to a red-headed little boy on Independence Day, 1872. Side note, I welcome you all back here on 4th of July for our Independence Day celebration. It is evident that from a very early age, Calvin deeply admired and respected his father. In his autobiography, the president lovingly describes the kind of man his dad was during his childhood years. He goes on and on in the first chapter about his father's jack-of-all-trades persona. Colonel John was the manager of the general store here in the village, as well as a farmer, carpenter, and erstwhile mechanic. Quote, if there was any physical requirement of country life which he could not perform, I do not know what it was, unquote, the president wrote in his autobiography. It was from his father that Calvin learned all the skills of farm life, although he would eventually move on and become a lawyer himself. His father was also a local politician here in Plymouth Notch. It was from his father that President Coolidge learned the importance of public service. We know well the long succession of offices that President Coolidge held on his road to the White House, starting as a city council member in Northampton, Massachusetts, and climbing the greasy pole, it seems deliberately, but probably not deliberately. It was just luck and good service that got him where he was. But he was the clerk of the county court in Hampshire County, Massachusetts. He was a state representative in the Massachusetts House, mayor of Northampton, state senator in the Massachusetts Senate, president of the Massachusetts Senate, lieutenant governor of Massachusetts, governor of Massachusetts, then vice president of the United States, then president of the United States. I don't think there's any president in history who's held that succession of offices in that deliberate manner, starting literally from, town office all the way to the White House. It's pretty remarkable. But we should also note that the public service habit was not something that just came out of nowhere. It was a family tradition. Calvin's father held many offices, and a number of them concurrently here in the village. He was a selectman, town agent, collector, constable, school superintendent, road commissioner, and town auditor, as well as a deputy sheriff here in Windsor County. So all those police officers you see on Route 4 in Bridgewater, they're following in the tradition of Colonel John. In 1872, the year Calvin was born, Colonel John was elected to the Vermont House of Representatives. And President Coolidge recalls visiting his father in Montpelier during the legislative session. Years later, when he was about 4 years old. Because Coolidge was born in 1872, and the colonel was elected in September of that year, so he wouldn't have remembered the first year he was in the legislature. It was on one of these trips during the president's very early years that his paternal grandfather, Calvin Coolidge, who was also a state senator, sat him on the governor's chair in the State House, a chair I've also sat on, against the rules, but we won't mention that. Anyways, Calvin Coolidge may have been prescient, given the fact that a future governor was in his arms, because Calvin would go on to become governor of Massachusetts, just for the wrong state. There was an instance in Calvin's early life that may have proven formative for his political outlook. As you know, town meetings are a staple of New England municipal government, and it was no different in Calvin's day, probably even stronger back then. One year at town meeting, some of the more prosperous farmers wanted to raise a large tax to reduce the town's debt burden. Colonel John abstained from voting on this matter. When Calvin asked him why he hadn't cast a vote, he replied that his abstention was rooted in his desire not to take sides in the dispute, since he himself could afford to pay the tax, but he did not want to levy it on those farmers who couldn't afford it. As we all know, in his many years of public service, President Coolidge was particularly sensitive to tax rates, not just as an issue of economics, but as a moral issue. He believed that high tax rates were detrimental to economic growth, and that, quote, the property of the people belongs to the people, unquote. One of my favorite Coolidge quotes is from a speech he gave on the White House lawn on August 11, 1924, that was filmed by newsreel cameras that you can actually watch on YouTube today. I can't imagine President Coolidge ever imagined that he would end up on YouTube someday, but he is there. And I can almost quote it verbatim, and using Coolidge's inflection and whatnot, but I won't do that. I'll just quote it, in my own voice. I want the people of America to be able to work less for the government and more for themselves. I want them to have the rewards of their own industry. This is the chief meaning of freedom. Until we can reestablish a condition under which the earnings of the people can be kept by the people, we are bound to suffer a very severe and distinct curtailment of our liberty, unquote. In line with this philosophy, the president fought what biographer Amity Schlaze has referred to as the tax crusade, to get the top marginal rate down to 25%, which he accomplished with the Revenue Act of 1926. We have no intimations of a direct connection, but I think it's safe to say that these early encounters with the exigencies of taxes and government policy at town meeting here in Plymouth helped inform his later ideas about federal tax policy. We can also see from the way Colonel John related in business to his fellow Plymouth citizens that his example was very important to the president. The colonel never made a huge profit, only about $100 a month according to the president's autobiography, but he always worked very hard and hated to see things wasted. These were the values of the New England farmer that Coolidge brought to the White House in his later years, working assiduously to cut the budget, lower tax rates, and pay down the national debt. William Allen White even referred to Coolidge as a Puritan in Babylon, the Scrooge who begat plenty, because in that high-flying age of flappers and jazz, Coolidge spent his presidential years bringing the principles of the New England farmer to the work of the presidential office. We all know the results: rock-bottom unemployment levels, massive economic growth, rising incomes for ordinary workers, astonishing improvements in technology. One cannot say enough for those old Yankee values embodied by our 30th president. Continuing on the theme of thrift and money, it's terribly interesting how often Calvin relied upon his father for financial assistance. If you read the letters published by the Vermont Historical Society, you will notice that the issue of money was a common theme. In these letters, many of Coolidge's expenses are related to his schooling. First at St. John's Berry Academy in Vermont, then at Amherst College in Massachusetts. And here's a letter I'm going to quote from that Calvin wrote in 1895 on February 3rd from Amherst. My dear father, it has been rather cold here for some time now, but the sleighing is fine. Dr. Johnson of Chicago spoke at the college church this morning. I did not like him so well as some others, but I think he speaks the truth. My landlord wants some pay for the board. I owe him about $20, and in connection with my fraternity, I shall have to pay about $50. Soon for initiation, term fee and pin. There will be another term fee due next spring, but they are small. Just how much, I believe, it is not said outside the members, but something like $5. Then there will be some extras in the same connection that will probably make up the cost at the end of the year to around $75. As I wrote you before, reminding him, I guess the check hadn't arrived yet. As I was going to write, I must pay some board right away, and the other bill may be paid at any time, but I should like the pin soon. College men are always proud to wear a society, Greek letter pin, and are very seldom seen without it. I should like it very much if my expenses were less, but as far as I can judge, I do not pay out. So he's telling his dad that he's not wasting his money, the money that he sends him. Except where the return is of more value to me than the money, but where my circumstances different, I of course should act on another basis. I am simply trying to get the most out of my opportunities, whether I consider them as a chance to improve my hard study or to improve in some other lines by a judicious use of the money that my circumstances afford me. I have paid out about $5 of the money you have sent me before for current expenses. So I have some by me, though I have lent some, which will be returned in a day or so, I expect. There, that is my currency bill, and I hope you will give it more approval than Congress gives Cleveland's ideas of currency. My work is keeping, side note, President Coolidge, this is right before the 1896 election, which was the great free silver election that pitted Benjamin Harrison, William McKinley against William Jennings Bryan, who gave the Cross of Gold speech at the 1896 Democratic Convention. And Coolidge was a big-time McKinley fan. So that dig at Cleveland was in keeping with his McKinley republicanism. My work is keeping me pretty busy most of the time, so I do not have so much time as I should like to write my essays and orations. About all I have done so far is to read up on some of my subjects. At present, I am writing a history essay on Daniel Webster. I should like very much to read all his great speeches and other works, but cannot do so now. If I could read and digest the principal works of Burke, Hamilton, and Webster, I should get a very strong hold on legal and political ideas. And then if I could add to it some actual experience of my own, I should have a wisdom that at least would ensure me a living if it did not give me power to direct great measures for the welfare of communities and states. But I'm only trying to get some discipline now. I never earned any money, and I do not know as I ever made any happiness, but I hope these may come later. I am almost ready to think of coming home again, though there are a number of hours of work for me to do before the term is done. I hope I may hear from you often. With love, J. Calvin Coolidge. Discuss the possibility of Calvin attending law school. Ultimately, the family ended up deciding Calvin would read the law as a clerk in the office of Hammond and Field in Northampton, Massachusetts, thereby skipping the cost of law school. And here's a letter Calvin wrote in 1899, January 13th, from Northampton. My dear Father, since Tuesday I have not been very well. Almost everyone is sick around here. It is impossible to get a nurse anywhere. I have been out all the time, but I feel rather weak. My first year is almost done. This is after he's become a lawyer. I think the business I have taken in will amount to just about $1,200, of which I have received some less than $600. My personal expenses are just about $175, and the expenses of running an office amount to a good deal in the course of the year. I am short of money again, and think I shall have to have about $40 before the 1st of February. A number of bills all due this month. I am in 3 bankruptcy cases, which will probably pay me $200 when they are settled. But to carry on 2 of them, I shall have to go to Boston and get admitted to the U.S. Circuit Court, which will cost me about $20. It takes considerable capital to do what little business I take in. I may get some money, I never can tell. I will write you again when I know what I must have. I hope this finds you all as comfortable as you can make yourselves. Your affectionately, Calvin Coolidge. P.S. I do not want any of those stockings. So, note that this last letter was written in 1899, several years after Coolidge had graduated from college and was already practicing law. His father was still subsidizing his son's professional endeavors years after he was already working. And this is the case if you read the letters through when he got married to Grace, when he had the kids, he's constantly asking for help from his dad. So he was never, they rented until after he was in the White House, or after he was out of the White House, Calvin and Grace, at the house on Massasoit Street in Northampton. So they were never super wealthy. He never made a lot of money from being a lawyer, and once he was in public service, that was much less time for him to practice law. So he relied on his dad to help subsidize his existence as a father and a husband, basically. It's also fascinating to think how similar in personality the 2 Coolidge men were. We all know of the silent Cal sobriquet bestowed on President Coolidge, but it seems that this trait didn't come from nowhere. According to one old story, Calvin was an absolute chatterer compared to his father. When invited to the White House on one occasion, Colonel John's letter simply replied, "Can't come," signed John Coolidge. Both men understood and lived something all too rare in our society today, that words have meaning, and you should only speak to improve upon the silence. And be prudent in the use of your words. President Coolidge once remarked that he'd never been harmed in political life by anything he didn't say. That might be why he won so many elections over the course of his career. The people knew that when he spoke, his words would matter. Silence was one of his greatest attributes, in my opinion. And I should also note that when it came to giving speeches and press conferences and all that sort of thing, Calvin was very loquacious. He gave more press conferences than any president before or since during his White House years. And he used the radio, the new media of that time, to get his message out to the American people, and wrote many of his own speeches, and his speeches are very eloquent. I would encourage all of you to read them. They're all on our website, coolidgefoundation.org. Their personal reticence also influenced the way the two related to one another. Most of the letters in Your Son, Calvin Coolidge, discuss routine family matters and the like, but occasionally one will stumble upon a particularly touching message from the President pen, such as this one written on August 2nd, 1925. My dear Father, it is 2 years tonight since you woke me to bring the message that I was president. It seems a very short time. I trust it has been a great satisfaction to you. I think only 2 or 3 fathers have seen their sons chosen to be President of the United States. I'm sure I came to it very largely by your bringing up and your example. If that was what you wanted, you have much to be thankful for, that you have lived so great an age to see it. Your son, Calvin Coolidge. That's just very poignant stuff. Of course, the occasion the President references in that letter is well known among the folks here at the Notch. On August 2nd, 1923, President Warren Harding died while visiting San Francisco. And then Vice President Calvin Coolidge was vacationing right here in Plymouth Notch at his father's home. Since there was no phone in the house, word came via telegram and messenger that Coolidge was now President of the United States. It was Colonel John who answered the knock at the door in the early morning hours of August 3rd, 1923, and received word that his son was now President. The Colonel went upstairs to wake his son and tell him the news. It was determined that, since Colonel John was a notary public, and notaries have the authority to administer oaths in the state of Vermont, that the good Colonel would administer the presidential oath of office to his son. The new president was sworn in by his father at 2:47 a.m. in the parlor of the homestead here at Plymouth Notch by the light of a kerosene lamp. It is without a doubt the most poignant presidential inauguration in American history. Because of this, Plymouth Notch will forever remain a stirring symbol of the peaceful transition of power and the efficient nature of the American constitutional system. Colonel John, later in his life, would comment to friends that he took great pride in the achievements of his only son. Yet it is questionable whether or not he ever actually voiced to his son directly how proud he was. They were not meant for, a lot of open displays of demonstrative affection. There is no doubt, however, that Coolidge was proud of his father. In his autobiography, he writes, quote, "At his advanced age, he had overtaxed his strength, receiving thousands of visitors who went to my old home at Plymouth. It was all a great satisfaction to him, and he would not have had it otherwise. When I was there, and visitors were kept from the house for a short period, he would be really distressed in the thought that they could not see all they wished, and he would go out where they were himself and mingle among them. Bill Jenny would be proud." He was the first historic site administrator, Bill. As the Colonel declined in health through 1925 and early 1926, the President tried to convince him to come down to Washington to live with him and Grace at the White House. But he refused to leave Plymouth Notch. In early March 1926, the Colonel's doctors told the President that his dad didn't have very long to live. So the President rushed to be at his bedside, but the Colonel died while the President was en route to Vermont. At his sadness, Calvin wrote, quote, "It costs a great deal to be president," unquote. 6 months after his father's demise, Calvin was interviewed and said, quote, "My father had qualities that were greater than any I possess. He was a man of untiring industry and great tenacity of purpose. He always stuck to the truth. It always seemed possible for him to form an unerring judgment of men and things. I cannot recall that I ever knew of his doing a wrong thing. He would be classed as decidedly a man of character. I have no doubt he is representative of a great mass of Americans who are known only to their local neighbors. Nevertheless, they are really great. It would be difficult to say that he had a happy life. He never seemed to be seeking happiness. He was a firm believer in hard work. Death visited the family often, but I have no doubt he took a satisfaction in accomplishment and always stood ready to meet any duty that came to him. He did not fear the end of life, but looked forward to it as a reunion with all he had loved and lost." Unquote. And so the story ends with the death of Colonel John in March 1926. Calvin laid his father to rest on the Vermont hillside, where so many of his ancestors and relatives also rest. Calvin's relationship to his father was pivotal to the man he would become. On this Father's Day in 2015, so many years later, it is helpful to reflect on the importance of dads as conveyors of presidential virtues. Colonel John bestowed upon his son the traits and values that would make him a great president. We celebrate the loving example of paternal care and concern he represented every day here at Plymouth Notch, where the legacy of these two men is preserved for posterity in the President Calvin Coolidge State Historic Site and with the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation. And I thank you very much for your time and your forbearance. Any questions? Questions? Yes, ma'am.
It sounded like in the beginning of your talk, you were talking about his experiences at college, and he was in a fraternity.
Yes.
What fraternity was that?
Oh, gosh.
Phi Gamma
Phi Gamma Delta.
Phi Gamma Delta?
Yes, and that's an interesting story. I'm glad you brought that up because President Coolidge was blackballed his first several years at Amherst. And Amherst was a Greek school in those days, very, very Greek. Everybody was a part of the fraternity. And I believe it was Dwight Morrow who would become one of his closest friends later on in life, who blackballed him originally. Because I don't know why. I guess people underestimated Calvin Coolidge, and that was true of his classmates as well. But as time went on, and he progressed in his years at Amherst, his classmates realized that he had gifts that they thought were important to share with others. And if I'm not mistaken, Coolidge gave the Grove Oration at his Amherst commencement at the end of his time at Amherst, which is a great speech that a student is selected by his peers to give at the commencement. So he was slow to start, but eventually he was a part of the fraternity. And as the letter shows, that added a number of expenses for his father to pay out. Any other questions?
Where did you find that last interview that he gave to the press about his father?
John, the son, quotes it in Your Son, Calvin Coolidge. I'm not sure where he got it from. I looked that up, but it's beautiful the way he describes his father. And I was, you know, Calvin Coolidge is like a holy object to me. I have such a reverence for Calvin Coolidge. So I was getting sort of emotional reading that. It's just beautiful to see the relationship that they had with one another. It really is remarkable. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
How old were you when you discovered Calvin Coolidge?
How old was I? That's a good question. Well, like most people, I learned about the Homestead Inaugural was the first thing I ever learned about related to Calvin Coolidge in my American history classes growing up in middle and high school. And that was really all I knew about Coolidge, that he was sworn in by his father by the light of a kerosene lamp. But when I was in grad school, actually, I read Amity Schlade's biography of Calvin Coolidge entitled Coolidge, which really opened my eyes to the importance of this president and why he's so awesome. He's just an incredible man. And I think that the great thing about Coolidge, like I mentioned earlier, is the fact that he came from such a small place, here in this village. It's remarkable that a small little community like this raise a president of the United States. And it shows the beauty and grandeur of our American constitutional system, which President Coolidge, apart from his policy beliefs, he was a very strong conservative, but he had a strong belief in the American ideal, the constitutional system that we have in this country, the democracy that we've developed as a nation, and the fact that our leaders don't come from royalty. You can be the son of a farmer in rural Vermont and grow up to become leader of our country, hold highest office in our country. It's a real testament to this nation. It's a fabulous nation where someone like Calvin Coolidge can become president of the United States, the leader of the free world. So I think anybody can draw inspiration from the example of Calvin.
Well, I sort of felt the same way. We have a home in Ludlow where he was with the
Black River
Academy, and I'm just amazed that sometimes he did have to walk from that academy
Yes.
back here.
Yes. Normally his father would go down and pick him up in
where-
Ludlow. President Coolidge, so I'm sure most of you know, President Coolidge attended high school in Ludlow at Black River Academy, which is now a museum, but back then it was a school. And he boarded there during the week, and on the weekends he'd come back up to Plymouth. And back then, of course, the roads were not as good. There were cars, that sort of thing. So everyone traveled in horse and buggy. So it took hours to get from Plymouth to Ludlow, which now it takes 15 minutes maybe. Back then, travel was very difficult. So he boarded in Ludlow, 12 miles down the road, but he boarded there during the week. Yes, Kathy?
I'm thinking about when I'm doing my tours, the buggy that's in the homestead, and thinking about Colonel John being a representative in the state senator, going all the way to Montpelier in that buggy.
Right.
Was the legislature in the winter back then?
That's a good question. Well, back in those days, the legislature was much more, they met for longer periods of time, and there weren't as many breaks. So they went up there and stayed for the session, the whole session. They lived there. And even when Calvin was in the legislature and governor of Massachusetts and all that sort of thing, working in Boston, 6 months out of the year, he was in Boston. And he didn't own an apartment or anything in Boston. He would stay at a hotel. And even when he was governor and lieutenant governor, he would stay at a hotel. He moved Grace and the boys to Massachusetts or to Boston when he was governor, but and got a larger room, I guess. But no, they'd have to go and they'd stay there. It wasn't like today. These days, when people go off to Washington, D.C. or to Montpelier, they can easily go home for the weekend and get back to their constituency. And that's an interesting thing of sort of the way our politics works today. We often lament that politics is so acrimonious these days. And a lot of that is due to the fact that the members don't get to know each other, know their families, and all that sort of thing. They don't have those non-political relationships that they once had that I think was important for greasing the political differences that members of Congress and members of legislatures had back in those days. They had a personal relationship with one another. These days, they don't have that personal relationship, which is unfortunate. But it's a consequence of easier travel, but something's definitely lost by that.
And of course, Colonel John, or not Colonel yet, would have taken a train up to Montpelier.
Yeah.
If you look in the permanent exhibit, we have a copy of the train pass that he was issued to be part of the
He
legislature.
didn't take that buggy all the way. I've been home a lot.
Okay. Colonel John did not take the buggy to Montpelier. That's good to know. Neither did Calvin. Yes.
Another question that just came to mind, where did he get the title colonel? I just don't remember hearing.
He was a military attaché or some such to the governor of Vermont in the early part of like 1901, I believe, is when he got that title. I'm not exactly sure what that office entailed. I think it was pretty
Colonel of
honorary.
the militia. It's an honorary title.
Yeah. He never served in the actual military.
We have his complete uniform, actually, in the collection.
Oh, very good.
very formal with a hat and everything.
Yeah. But it's very useful that he became colonel, because if you look at the Coolidge family tree, everyone's named Calvin or John. Everyone. So it's good. It's nice to be able to have that title to give to Colonel John to distinguish him from his grandson and from many other people in the family named John. So that's why Colonel John, Calvin, John the son of the president. So yeah. Yes, Mimi.
I just remember having one conversation with John Coolidge. You see him depicted here, these wonderful shades, the surviving son of Calvin Coolidge. And talking with him, you were referring to how amazingly educated Coolidge became. He really was self-educated. And John told us, and I'm sure he told Bill Jenny and John Dunhill, John Coolidge told us that it wasn't the presidency that President Coolidge felt was his legacy. It was his collection of books. It was his library, which, as we know, is now preserved and owned by his great-grandchildren.
Yeah.
But that was his legacy, and I think that speaks a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. The president valued learning, definitely. And he talks in his autobiography about professors at Amherst that played a huge role in his life. Garmin, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah, Garmin, and one other whose name is escaping me. But yeah, he very much valued education. When he was governor of Massachusetts, he raised teacher salaries, right? When he was in charge in Massachusetts. So Calvin Coolidge was definitely an education president, and that the family still owns, right? Is his
Yes.
library.
Yes.
Everything else they've pretty much given to the state of Vermont, to us, to Forbes Library, Vermont Historical Society, but they still have the library. So
Well, that says a lot.
Yeah.
That's just the heartbeat. And I believe a number of those books are on the American Constitution. I think he was a scholar of the American Constitution.
Yeah,
which
absolutely.
That's probably one of the reasons you do your debates around various aspects of it.
Absolutely. And
Constitution Day.
if you read the autobiography, something that's very interesting about President Coolidge's autobiography is he doesn't talk literally at all about any of his accomplishments while he was president. He doesn't say anything about what he did while he was president. He talks about the mechanics of the office of the presidency. It's all this constitutional talk, and what the president does, my schedule, the role of the president, and the role of the vice president, being the vice president, presiding over the Senate, that sort of thing. Receiving dignitaries, and all the bedrock sort of foundational aspects of the presidency. Reading the autobiography of Calvin Coolidge really is just a grand education in our constitutional framework. And it shows you that the president valued that so greatly. Yes, sir.
He was never elected president.
He was elected president.
He was elected?
He was. He ascended to the presidency. He succeeded to the presidency in 23 when Warren Harding died.
Okay.
But he was nominated by the Republican convention in 24 and was elected in something of a landslide.
So that was
before.
was the tail end of Harding's presidency.
Right. He served 67 months in the presidency,
Okay.
the last year and a half or so of Harding's term, and then 4 years of his own. And that was not, it wasn't a guarantee that he would be renominated. I mean, there were only a couple.
Yeah, it's hard to see him as running, campaigning for president.
Oh, well, he won all those offices,
That's right.
prior to becoming president. So Calvin, someone asked him once what was his hobby, and he said holding office was his hobby. So, he was a master politician. He really was. His strategy was to overpromise or underpromise and overdeliver, and that's why people loved him. He always kept his word and stuck to what he said he was going to do, and he got the results for the American people. And even though in the 24 election it was a three-way race, because it was a time in which the progressive movement was on the stage. You remember the 1912 election, Theodore Roosevelt running against the Bull Moose, which had split the Republican vote because the large chunk of the progressive vote was within the Republican Party. So TR running in 1912 split the Republican vote and allowed Woodrow Wilson to become president.
Right.
Wilson was the first Democrat elected president since Cleveland in 1890, if my memory serves me. 1892, yes. So it was a split in the GOP, and the same thing happened in 24. Robert LaFollette, fighting Bob LaFollette from Wisconsin, bolted the Republican Party and went to the Progressives and ran as the Progressive candidate. So there were 3 people on the ballot in 24, and Coolidge still won an outright majority. He won 54% of the vote, which was down from Harding's. Harding won in 1920 the highest percentage of the vote up till that point, winning 60% of the vote in 1920. Harding Coolidge, but it reduced a little bit under Calvin, but he still won. That's what's important. But he also won most of the states that Harding went to. He only lost Tennessee and Wisconsin. Wisconsin was the home state of LaFollette, so he won Wisconsin. And Tennessee was in the South, so it was kind of marginal. And it went back to the Democrats in 24. But Calvin still won, so that's what's important. Any other questions? No? Well, you've all been a wonderful audience. You have great questions. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you go to the bookstore and buy your son Calvin Coolidge. It's a wonderful compilation of all the letters that President Coolidge wrote to his father that the Vermont Division Society has. So thank you very much.